Why does history matter? For many, it feels like ancient stories buried under layers of dust. Yet, what if I told you history is alive? It shapes nations, defines identities, and dictates how power operates. In Russia, history is more than a reflection of the past. It's a weapon. Every nation molds history to serve its purpose, but Russia's manipulation goes beyond the ordinary. From the Romanovs to the Bolsheviks, from the Cold War to modern times, Russian leaders have systematically rewritten history. This isn't just their story, it's ours too. And today, we'll uncover the secrets they don't want us to know. For more than 300 years, the Romanov dynasty ruled over Russia, presenting themselves as divinely ordained leaders. Russian orthodoxy and imperial splendor legitimized their rule. Church rituals painted the Tsars as God's chosen. Tsar Alexander III's manifesto of 1881 declared, "Faith in autocracy is faith in Russia." But behind the gilded facade lay the suffering of millions. Serfs bound to landowners toiled under feudal oppression. By the 19th century, dissatisfaction simmered. Attempts to modernize, such as the 1861 emancipation of serfs under Alexander II, backfired when impoverished peasants discovered their newfound freedom meant being tied to crushing debt for decades. Then came industrialization, limited, rushed, and inequitable. While cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow grew, poverty festered. Strikes and uprisings increased, like the infamous Bloody Sunday massacre of 1905, when peaceful protesters were slaughtered by Tsar Nicholas II's troops. The 1905 revolution. This event shook the foundations of Russian autocracy. Workers demanded reforms, but the Tsar responded with cosmetic gestures. The creation of the Duma, parliament. The illusion of change masked autocratic continuity, fueling deeper resentment. The Romanov dynasty finally collapsed under the weight of its failures during World War I. By 1917, millions of Russian soldiers had died. Food shortages crippled cities, and mass protests erupted. In February, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated. A fragile provisional government arose, attempting to balance socialist and liberal agendas. But behind the chaos lurked the Bolsheviks, a radical Marxist faction led by Vladimir Lenin. Returning to Russia in a sealed train provided by Germany, whose goal was to destabilize its wartime enemy, Lenin exploited the vacuum. Despite being a minority party, the Bolsheviks seized power in October. Unlike the romanticized portrayal of a mass uprising, the reality was a calculated coup. Using slogans like peace, land, and bread, Lenin appealed to exhausted soldiers and starving peasants. Bolshevik success wasn't inevitable. It was strategic, amplified by propaganda that rewrote the revolution into a narrative of proletarian heroism. Under Joseph Stalin, history was molded through terror. In the 1930s, his ambitious 5-year plans industrialized the Soviet Union, but came at an unimaginable human cost. The Holodomor famine, 1932-33, a state-induced starvation in Ukraine, killed millions. This isn't just a Ukrainian tragedy, it's a scar on humanity, deliberately erased for decades. Simultaneously, Stalin launched the Great Purge. Old Bolsheviks, intellectuals, and perceived dissidents disappeared. Show trials aired confessions extracted through torture, convicting enemies of the state. Yet these purges didn't merely kill. Entire identities were erased. Photographs were doctored, erasing fallen figures from existence. The brutality extended to the gulags. These forced labor camps enslaved millions under conditions where starvation and frostbite were commonplace. Today, the memories of gulags are often overshadowed by Stalin's celebrated victories in World War II. For Russians, World War II, or the Great Patriotic War, is sacred. Celebrations commemorate the Soviet Union's immense sacrifice in defeating Nazi Germany. Over 27 million Soviets died, more than any other nation. Yet, there's a shadow side to this history. What about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, 1939? A secret treaty between Hitler and Stalin to divide Eastern Europe. Poland was invaded and carved up. Baltic states like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were annexed into the Soviet Union. These events contradict the narrative of Soviet moral superiority, which remains unacknowledged in mainstream Russian accounts. The Siege of Leningrad, the Battle of Stalingrad, and the Red Army's triumph in Berlin highlight Soviet bravery. But atrocities committed during the Red Army's occupation, such as mass assaults in East Prussia, remain shrouded in silence. The Cold War wasn't just about missiles, it was about controlling minds. Soviet propaganda glorified the USSR as a workers' paradise, contrasting it with the greed of Western capitalism. America became the villain, its prosperity cast as a facade of exploitation. Meanwhile, cultural and scientific achievements turned into ideological battlegrounds. Sputnik, 1957, the first artificial satellite, and Yuri Gagarin's spaceflight, 1961, marked Soviet milestones. These victories were genuine, but the state omitted technological failures and human sacrifices. By the 1980s, cracks in the Soviet narrative became undeniable. Economic stagnation, corruption, and discontent undermined the government. The policies of glasnost and perestroika under Mikhail Gorbachev attempted reforms, but unintentionally accelerated collapse. In December 1991, the USSR dissolved into 15 independent states. For many Russians, this was a traumatic loss of superpower status. The narrative of Soviet greatness left behind deep nostalgia, a void that modern leaders like Vladimir Putin have sought to fill by reshaping history. Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea reveals modern historical manipulation. Official narratives framed it as a reunification with ancestral Russian land. Missing from this story are the mass deportations of Crimean Tatars under Stalin and their ongoing marginalization. Such omissions perpetuate myths that justify modern actions. Russia isn't alone in rewriting history. Governments worldwide, from the denial of genocides to the whitewashing of colonial empires, use selective memory to consolidate power. Since Vladimir Putin came to power in 2000, Russia has undergone a transformation rooted in nostalgia for Soviet power and prestige. Putin has consistently portrayed himself as the restorer of Russian greatness, drawing heavily on a revised narrative of history. Putin's regime controls the story Russians are told, painting the 1990s as a time of chaos and humiliation caused by Western interference. By invoking the glories of the Soviet Union and the supposed historical inevitability of Russian dominance, Putin has crafted a sense of destiny for his nation, one centered on reclaiming lost territory and influence. Central to this ideology is Putin's claim that Russia is entitled to protect Russian-speaking populations outside its borders, a narrative used to justify territorial incursions and meddling in neighboring countries. The first clear example of Putin's modern expansionist ambitions came with the Russo-Georgian War in 2008. Georgia, a former Soviet republic, had been moving closer to NATO and the European Union, a move Russia viewed as a direct threat. Tensions escalated when Georgia attempted to retake South Ossetia, a breakaway region with strong ties to Moscow. Russia responded with overwhelming force, claiming it was protecting ethnic Russians. In just 5 days, Russia effectively secured control over South Ossetia and Abkhazia, another separatist region. Both territories remain under Russian influence, though internationally recognized as part of Georgia. This brief yet decisive war sent a chilling message to former Soviet states. Alignment with the West could provoke a military response. The West's relatively muted reaction, limited to sanctions and diplomatic condemnations, emboldened Moscow to continue testing the boundaries of international tolerance. Ukraine's story offers one of the most striking examples of modern Russian historical manipulation and aggression. Following Ukraine's 2013-2014 Euromaidan protests, which led to the ousting of a pro-Russian president, Putin framed the event as a Western-engineered coup designed to undermine Russian interests. Seizing the moment of Ukrainian political instability, Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. The official narrative: Crimea had always been Russian. Despite its 1954 transfer to Ukraine by Khrushchev and centuries of Crimean Tatar history, and its inhabitants were merely reuniting with the motherland. What's often overlooked in the Russian narrative are the voices of the Crimean Tatars, who suffered mass deportations under Stalin and have faced systemic repression since the annexation. Today, Crimea's Tatars and pro-Ukrainian communities endure silenced dissent, further erasing their version of history. Simultaneously, Russia-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine declared independence, leading to a bloody war in the Donbas region. While Moscow officially denies involvement, extensive evidence reveals that Russian soldiers, funding and equipment have been pivotal in the conflict. These moves were justified by the Kremlin using rhetoric about protecting Russian speakers and combating a Nazi threat in Ukraine, echoing World War II narratives to solidify domestic support and muddy international discourse. On February 24, 2022, Russia shocked the world by launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Labeling it a special military operation, Putin justified the attack as necessary to denazify Ukraine, prevent NATO expansion, and protect Russians in the Donbas. What followed was a humanitarian disaster. Cities like Mariupol and Kharkiv were reduced to rubble, with millions of Ukrainians fleeing their homes. Atrocities such as the Bucha massacre where civilians were executed, exposed the brutal reality of Russia's invasion. The global response has been unprecedented, with heavy sanctions crippling Russia's economy and NATO rallying to support Ukraine with arms and intelligence. Yet the war drags on, raising questions about Russia's endgame. Russia could attempt to destabilize Moldova, particularly the breakaway region of Transnistria, where Russian troops are stationed. This tiny strip of land has been a frozen conflict zone since the early 1990s, and any move here would echo the playbook used in Georgia and Ukraine. These NATO members are at constant risk, given their shared border with Russia and significant Russian-speaking populations. Moscow could attempt to stir unrest, as it has done elsewhere, but the NATO membership of these states acts as a deterrent. With its vast energy resources and significant Russian minority, Kazakhstan could become a target for Russian intervention, particularly if its policies lean too far toward the West or China. One of Putin's key grievances is NATO expansion. After the Cold War, NATO extended into Eastern Europe, bringing former Soviet states like Poland and the Baltic nations under its security umbrella. From Russia's perspective, this is an encroachment on its sphere of influence. But for countries on Russia's border, NATO serves as a shield against aggression. Without NATO, it's likely that Putin's ambitions would extend further, especially into unprotected states like Moldova or Georgia. Russian aggression ended as a wake-up call for NATO and strengthened unity. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has breathed new life into NATO, uniting members against a common threat. Increased defense spending. Countries like Germany and Poland have ramped up military budgets to meet the challenges posed by Moscow. Future enlargement. Ukraine and potentially other vulnerable nations may push harder for NATO membership despite Russian warnings. Global consequences of Russian aggression. Russia's actions in Ukraine have caused energy crises, disrupting global oil and gas markets. European nations, historically reliant on Russian gas, are scrambling to find alternatives. Russia's aggression inspires other autocratic regimes, signaling that territorial revisionism might be achievable if the West doesn't present a united front. From food supply disruptions to proxy wars, Russian aggression creates ripple effects that exacerbate global conflicts and economic inequality. Russia's closer ties with China, coupled with strained relations with the West, contribute to a growing divide in global politics. Russia's manipulation of history and aggressive actions remind us of the power of narratives to justify modern-day atrocities. But they also show the resilience of nations standing against oppression, whether it's Ukraine, Georgia, or Baltic states committed to preserving their independence. As citizens, we must remain vigilant. Understanding these patterns helps us challenge the manipulation of truth and resist the erosion of sovereignty, democracy, and human rights. What do you think? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video to join this critical conversation. Together we can ensure history informs us rather than enslaves us.